so much, Alistair, and thank you everyone for coming and for showing your interest. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and speak on a subject that actually lost a bit of popularity in the mainstream media, but it's still not forgotten by those who care about the fate of Ukraine, and especially people like me. And I do care not only because I'm Ukrainian, but also because I find Ukraine very interesting. So I was, let me briefly introduce myself. So I was born in Ukraine, and Ukraine was part of Soviet Union at that time. And I was even lucky to go to a totalitarian school. So Soviet Union collapsed when I was in grade 3. So if you read Matilda by Roald Dahl, so it's very similar to what I was experienced, except for, yeah, not so extreme, of course, but the humiliation was one of the major tools there. And except for Matilda and her classmates knew it was wrong, but me and my classmates, we didn't. We thought it was how it's supposed to be. I went to uni in the independent Ukraine, but because I studied political science and our lecturers had just switched from teaching communism to teaching political science, and because we already had a little bit of freedom to travel and to freedom of information, so I kind of understood it's not the education I really want. So I went to Germany to do my master's in sociology in Germany. And after that, I returned to Ukraine and worked as a head of research and analysis in a small but very brave think tank. And then my son was born, and then soon after the Maidan Revolution started, and I became quite anxious at that time and decided to relocate to Australia with my family. And we left Ukraine in 2016, but I professionally, socially, and emotionally, I'm still very involved. I teach at the Ukrainian Catholic University. I teach critical thinking remotely. I also consult a couple of organizations from Ukraine, including Ukrainian Public Broadcaster. My research interest is on the role of education in the transition to democracy, and I want Ukraine to be my showcase. I'm currently looking for a supervisor for my prospective PhD, and my dream is to, after that, to help countries in transition to fine-tune the educational system. And I want to help teachers, especially in schools, to adjust the instruction and attitude towards developing of reflecting thinking skills. I believe it's one of the key elements that missing in Ukraine at the moment and is essential for democratization. So I would like to start, can we start the presentation? Yes, so I have the clicker. Yes, I would like to start my presentation with a quote from an American expat living in Ukraine for some time, an acquaintance of mine. He said that Ukraine is never as good or as bad as it seems, and sometimes it's hard to figure out whether it seems good or bad, and even that is not really, if you do try to figure out, then it's not really like it. And I like the way he described the difficulty of understanding a society in transition for a person raised in an established democracy with a more or less predictable environment and institutions. And in Ukraine, some things are quite advanced, like problem solving or resilience or ability to work while they're hearing air raid sirens. And it was quite tricky for me while I'm still teaching remotely, and one day my students say, oh, it's we need to just move to the basement and keep going, and I feel anxious being so far away from all the shellings, but they kind of adjusted and keep going. But some of the things, well, some of the things are quite advanced, but some are quite basic. Are missing. For example, to ability to form opinions. And I will get back to that a bit later in the presentation. and understanding democracy in its principles, understanding what it is and what it involves. So I'm a sociologist, and for a sociologist, understanding how a society transitions from one operational system to another is very interesting. But on the other hand, living in such an environment, it's challenging and it demands a lot of courage. And I must admit that I unfortunately lost that courage once I became a mother. So I decided that I will be more helpful here than I was there. And it's still, I still have a tremendous survivor guilt. Some may argue that Ukraine came to be just recently and the Russian invasion united and created Ukrainian nation. I would argue the opposite. So the way Ukraine has been resisting the invasion demonstrate that there was actually some effort done to in the past to be able to do that. And I can proudly say that I have been part of that effort since around 2007 and being actively involved in the civil society initiatives and intellectual discussions. And my presentation will not be strictly academic. I'm sharing my observations and point of view and trying to support it with evidence and reasoning where I can. But some of the conclusions will be just my observations, and I hope to put them under scrutiny later in my prospective research. So looking at the map, I'm constantly amazed how huge Russia is. And I would argue that our main Ukrainian existential challenge was this huge seductive pressure from Russia. I can recommend a book by Peter Pomerantsev, who is now living and working in London. He is doing a great job in revealing how tricky and advanced Russia's propaganda is, and that it's very hard to defeat it. And the other source is a recent report on the evidence of Russian influence in Europe, which is still quite strong and present. I'm mentioning Russia here only to show that it has been a huge force pulling Ukrainian people towards it. And, you know, being a civil activist, we used to say that democracy offers the ordinary Ukrainian citizens hard work and Russia offers cookies. And, of course, huge market, a lot of money, power in exchange for your Ukrainian identity and national ambitions. And it worked for many people, and it worked for my parents, and it worked for me for some time until after witnessing innocent people die, protecting their right to have an accountable president on Maidan, during Maidan Revolution. Only then I realized how toxic Russia's influence still is, basically. So the invasion did not create Ukrainian nation. It happened many years before, but what the invasion did, though, it helped people understand that you can't really trade freedom for safety and understand that it was an illusion. And probably for the first time, it became very obvious, especially for those living in the eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, which was more influenced by Russian media, economy, and politics. And as many of you probably know, Ukraine's history in the 20th century was quite dramatic. Famine in the 30s, two world wars, Stalin and the Soviet Union, Russification and terror. But we survived, and when Russians set our wheat on fire, so as you can see in the pictures, it's already during this full-scale invasion, so people were still working on the land trying to harvest and save it. So having fertile soil, mild climate, and skillful and hard-working people, the land became very attractive for more powerful and influential neighbors. At the same time, Ukraine struggled to have its own elite to manage all that. So, and Ukraine's location is a curse, a very strong current was pulling people towards power and familiarity of Russia because of massive effort of Russification, and those who opposed were basically targeted and destroyed. So it's now more or less obvious that we don't have a friendly neighbor, unfortunately, but an abuser. But it wasn't that obvious before 2013. So I like to use a metaphor. Ukraine was kind of sedated a little bit, offering benefits for those playing along and quietly removing those who were against. And I was just wanted to share with you those couple of facts about Ukrainian history and the destruction of the Mariupol Drama Theater, as you probably recognize on a picture. So the stimuli for democratization in Ukraine originated more from the outside and were not very clear for the population overall. So shortly after the Maidan Revolution, I was lucky to talk to Marju Lauristin. She's former Minister of Social Affairs of Estonia and former member of the European Parliament. And she told me that Estonia knew that they needed NATO and EU even before the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there was no such understanding in Ukraine. So Russia's influence was still very strong, and there was no clarity. What do we need to do? Which foreign vector we need to take? And I will show a couple of data at the end of the presentation supporting that. So Ukrainian journey to democracy started quite late, relatively late, I would say, later than, for example, Baltic countries. And it started with mostly protests, so protests against something, usually against an unfair ruler or some kind of injustice. So if you can see that the inertia of understanding that there has to be a big, strong ruler, but there is something wrong with him, we need to protest. And I guess the spirit of the protest came from mostly Western regions that had more freedom and proximity to Poland and other European countries. But the understanding of democratic mechanism was still very limited, even in those Western regions. So to say, we need to move towards EU, why? We don't know, just because. NATO, why? Not really sure. I assume that it was mostly because of protection, but what kind of protection, it was also unclear at that time. Okay, it was clear for some of the population, but not for broader population. So what needs to be done? These questions were not even raised. And I remember when we starting our research at the think tank on that question of what the values of Ukrainians are. We tried to find research companies that were doing this type of research, and we struggled with it. So even for the government and for big businesses, for NGOs, they were not asking these questions at that time. So the most question was how to fight a bad system, how to fight against a government that is hostile, and how to fight against dehumanizing legislation. And that mattered as well. And that was also important, but that was far not enough. So one of the reasons for not knowing what to do, I think, I assume that was due to Soviet destruction of the elites, and there was no managerial capacity, so no vocabulary developed in Ukrainian language of how to manage what to do. The education was still very totalitarian. And for example, if Estonia, after gaining independence, straight away tried to reform its education, the reform of education is still in progress in Ukraine. It's still going. It's still not completely clear what exactly needs to be changed. And many people were displaced to prevent local nationalism, and the level of unpredictability in the society is quite high, which make the people focus on here and now and being enabled to think strategically. So the protest started against old communist elites. President Kravchuk, here, black and white picture, was replaced by Kuchma at the top, who was very soon who became very soon unfavorable as well. So people protested against him. Then the next presidential elections were falsified, and people protested against that. Yushchenko was quite an interesting character. He was poisoned just before the elections, and that crime is still unsolved. And as a result of the Orange Revolution, he won the election, but he was probably, I don't know, it's hard for me to say. I'm not, although I have an education in political science, but I'm not a politologist. I don't know quite sure why he didn't last. Too soft, maybe to resist very skillful and powerful demagogues supported by Russia and oligarchs, a dreamer. But he managed, one of the most important things he did, he managed to get famine to be recognized as genocide against Ukrainians. And that was very important, also played a big role in our future democratization. So the elections were held again, and it was Yanukovych against Tymoshenko. Tymoshenko is not here because she wasn't the president, but you probably remember her. She had a plait around her head. And while the others were quite blunt in their propaganda, Tymoshenko was using a lot of fancy manipulation to become to power. And I remember that these elections felt like an absolute defeat of democratization efforts at that time. So it was like two evils, one evil against the other evil, absolute frustration and helplessness. And I remember voting for Yanukovych just because it was a very obvious evil, while Tymoshenko was a devil in disguise. So, and I must admit that Yanukovych over there seemed quite clumsy and ridiculous, and he produced a lot of memes, and making fun of him was kind of escape from harsh reality for the activists. And I will just show you a 30 seconds video from the official ceremony of the memory of the soldiers of the Second World War. So this is Yanukovych and Medvedev, the Russian puppet president at that time, in 2010. Oh, can we pause the video for a second and then play it? So it's, yeah, excellent. It's going now. Yeah, so it's downloaded. Yeah, so they were putting those wreaths, and it was quite a harsh weather, raining. Everything is very official, a lot of bodyguards around, and then the wind. Yep. So that the press secretary of Yanukovych was trying to destroy that video, but it was impossible at that time. It spread way too fast, and we had a lot of memes where there's like a wreath falls, and then an evil, a grand piano, a rocket, a plane. So it was fun making fun of him, but. And he also promised to sign the association agreement with the EU. But at that time also, it was the time that intellectuals, broad intellectuals, started public discussion on the future of Ukraine, maybe for the first time in the new era, and trying to understand how Ukraine is different from other countries and why we need to move towards NATO and the EU and so on. And I was part of that initiative. I'm very proud of that. And it was such a great time just discussing and dreaming about the country we want to have. And once a month, we gathered for 3-4 hours to look at the research and try to understand how to enable democracy in Ukraine. But Yanukovych didn't sign the association agreement, and people started to protest again. Then the government tried to suppress that and tried to adopt a law that peaceful protestants can now be arrested. I remember it felt terribly bad. Like suddenly just wearing a bicycle helmet became enough reason to arrest a person. And I felt threat to security and for my physical security as well. And at that time, I realized that it can be quite serious. It can become quite serious. And the protest became more and more intense. And it's interesting that I felt really safe on Maidan, on the Maidan Square where the tents were put up, and I felt really unsafe outside of it. It was also very interesting to watch how people tried to prevent provocations and were very determined to remain peaceful. And even the rhetorics on the stage were trying to be kind of polite, not very, very radical. But then the government forces started killing people, and then we fought back and Yanukovych escaped. So we continued public discussions and gatherings of our small groups of intellectuals, and we started to look at the values survey. So we're trying to understand where Ukraine is, what Ukrainian values are, and especially because I'm a sociologist, it was a very interesting task for me. And we came across the Engelgard-Welzel World Cultural Map. It has an interesting methodology, and you might see that Ukraine is on the left in the red area. So I will briefly explain what it shows. It shows survival values versus self-expression values. From the left to the right and from the bottom to top, traditional values versus secular values. And Engelgard and Welzel claim that the poorer countries are on the left bottom corner and the richer countries on the right top corner. So that gave us an idea, okay, we need to move that direction. This is the way. But of course, Engelgard and Welzel didn't say that it was a causal connection, it's just a correlation, it happened to be. And also with the methodology, we had a couple of issues that we couldn't really apply that correctly to the Ukrainian society. For example, if we look at the traditional versus secular values, then the importance of God is considered a very traditional value, though in Ukraine, the church was played a role of preservation of nation in the time of Soviet repression that was very what is the word? Agnostic. When they forbid religion and other things, like, for example, but the and also on the survival self-expression, for example, petitions are worthless, right? So we kind of understood that petitions are worthless because protest is the method. So not because it's not considered a tool of democracy, but also because sometimes you need to be more radical than that. And this is an interesting map because it shows the result. It takes a long time to gather all the data, so it has like a little span of results, and you might think that it's changing very fast, but it's not. So, for example, if you look at the map, oh, I don't have the title, but it's the 2004. So it's similar, right? So Ukraine is in the similar spot and doesn't change so fast. And we also try to, because this map is relative, so it shows the position of countries relative to each other, we try to use the methodology and study the Ukrainian society in itself, just using this methodology. And we found out, sorry for the Ukrainian language, so it's Ukraine overall, but it's a schematic. They are situated schematically, not very precise. So you will see that the survival is the biggest bubble, right? So we will still have a lot of people who are still in this area of survival and tradition. We tried another methodology. We tried the European social survey, and they offer other indicators, like similar idea, like it's that probably the Maslow pyramid is in base of it. So the needs that are secure, basic, are on the foundation of the development, and then the higher ranked needs are on top. But here you can see we try to compare Western Europe, Scandinavian countries, Southern Europe, and post-Soviet Europe and Ukraine. We had a hypothesis that Ukraine is similar to Southern Europe, so like Italy or Spain. But, you know, we couldn't find like very significant similarities, although it's interesting to see, for example, that the power has the highest rate for Ukrainians. And I assume that's because power means protection, power means survival, more chances for survival as well. And also, if you look at the elections, so we can also say that power can help you raise your chances to survive. But also, for example, the self-direction is the lowest, right? So it's the idea that I can change something. I'm responsible for what is happening to me. And there is another methodology by Hofstede, which is more used for commercial, for businesses, to understand the culture of people you're working in. And here you can see that we are very close to Russia in our values. So it's also, it's hard for us, for example, for me as a sociologist, to find, you know, find a methodology that will confirm my idea that we Ukrainians need to move towards Europe, because it takes a long time. Values don't change overnight, of course, and it takes a lot of condition to transform. So we also realized that while we're in this survival mode, so the ideas of democracy are a little bit distorted, like in mirror, fun park mirror, they called. So when you see it differently, right? So for example, if you look at the elections, what are elections for people in a survival mode is your chance to exchange your vote for some benefits. For example, when we had local elections, so the candidates were coming to the local community and say, what are your needs? And I say, okay, we need to do this playground, this park, these streets, and can you do this? I said, yes, I will. And the other candidate will say, okay, I will do better, right? I will do that. So then it's kind of an exchange of your voice for these benefits. And there were also stories when people were selling their voices for some money. And that was also, I think it's an indicator of this state of survival. When you see the opportunity, you need to grab it. Also, the corruption. If we look at the corruption and understanding of corruption in a developed world, then it's a distortion of a good system. But in Ukraine, the corruption was a tool of survival against a bad system. And it's also interesting to, it was an interesting discussion with international donors and organizations that were trying to help, saying that we need to start fighting corruption from the grassroots level. And we're saying, no, it will not work. We need to give people tools of survival and start from the top. And that was very interesting discussion, because the democracy starts from the bottom, right? But also to be able to start that process, those who have power need to restrict their power themselves, right? So they need to understand we need to find some tools to limit our power. Media and information, it was a way to punish your offenders. So for example, if someone was unfair, okay, I will call the journalist, don't do that. So that was also a tool. And European Union and NATO, I think my assumption is better opportunities, quality of life. Now that we are approaching the association agreement with European Union and moving towards it, then people start to realize, wow, we need to make a lot of adjustments, especially to our businesses. There are so many requirements. Are we ready for that? And also what is very interesting in juvenile, for example, justice, right? So when the state has power to take the kids from the parents and parents say, no, like government is hostile, we will not be, we are not ready to accept the juvenile justice. And also poor understanding of institutions. When you are in a survival mode that everything is kind of moving very, happening very like here and there. If you imagine you are driving a car and you don't know if your brakes working properly, you don't know if your steering wheel is working, you don't have headlights, you don't have wipers that work, and the road is dark and full of potholes. So right, what will be your speed? You will be crawling, right? You will be moving very slow and cautiously. And similar with the society, so we are always on alert. And I was amazed moving to Australia that people leave their cars open, that dogs are friendly to people. Really, that was a very interesting discovery. And that people can carry their phones just in their back pockets of their jeans. And it was all very, very strange for me because it felt unsafe, and it felt like I need to always hold my pockets tight and always watch. And it was interesting how different my son was behaving after moving to Australia. He was 5 when we moved, and he was much more relaxed after that. On the playground, he was not scanning the perimeter before entering the playground. Yeah, so it's a different mode of operation. And in this situation, understanding of institutions is something very distant. So I remember hearing the term institutional trust for the first time when I went to study in Germany. So I didn't even know what that was. How can you trust an institution? You trust a person, or you don't trust a person. And also, if we look at the elections, they're also very personal. So at this person, not the political party with the ideology, but the political party of someone, of this person or the other person. And the legacy of the hostile government as well. So it's the legislation that is that keeping a person in between, in the gray zone of the law. So you really need to fight really hard to stay in this wide area, and you don't always know if you are. So that gives the government power to assume that you're guilty in any time at once. And I will show you now very briefly a couple of data. So there are not so many available in English language. So the one I found was by supported by International Republican Institute in Ukraine. And so this was before the invasion. And you can briefly skip through the methodology. It was in this area of Ukraine. So you see Crimea and part of Luhansk and Donetsk were already occupied at that time. So east, west, south, and center. So in general, would you say that Ukraine is heading in the right direction or in the wrong direction? This is my favorite slide. So if you can see how it developed. So people were really thinking like, no, it's the wrong direction. But if you ask them, which direction should we go? We don't know. And that was a very challenging question, also because Ukraine is so diverse. So we have so many different people living in Ukraine, and finding a common ground was very, very, very tricky. Also, it was not only the question of regions. So it was not the question of age or your economical situation. It was like overall feeling that no, we're heading the wrong direction. And it changed kind of a little bit just after the elections, but then it dropped again. And also, do you approve or disapprove activities of the parliament? And also, you can see that red is disapprove, right? And it's interesting that in some studies you can see, do you trust the parliament or the government? And it also, I think they changed the wording for approve, disapprove, because it's more understandable, because trust is also kind of weird if you don't put a person to it. And here we have the data for NATO and European Union. Oh no, this is European Union, next one will be NATO. So if you can see, so before Maidan Revolution, there was still very strong support for customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. But after Maidan Revolution, which happened in 13-14, so it started to shift a bit, and also NATO. So you can see a similar picture, but also with NATO was not so so strongly in favor or against. This is one of the most recent study. Yeah, so you can see that the dates there. So it's April 22 and 23. And you can kind of compare it to the first slide I showed. Do you think that the country is moving in the right direction or wrong direction? But here I would argue that it doesn't really correlate with the understanding of what the parliament and government are doing. So it's, again, more about the people who fight, more about the volunteers than institutions. Oh, sorry, yeah, this is the title, so they have to be swapped. And methodology, and you see the area that is not now occupied, so it wasn't included in the survey. Yes, and NATO is now more favorable, of course. It's now becoming more obvious that that's the way we should move, and that's because it gives us security. And also interesting that the even eastern and southern regions are quite for NATO, which was absolutely not the case a couple of years ago. And also you can see some of the attitudes towards the institutions. And it's interesting if you look at the formulation there. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Metro Kuleba, so it's the name, not the ministry itself, but it also has to have a name. And the Cabinet of Ministers under Denis Shmyhal, so it's the name of the Prime Minister, and so it's kind of still connecting it to a person who is in charge. That was the 2023. It's sorry, it's the same survey, this one. Oh, it's the other way. Can I move it back? Sorry. Yeah, yeah. This one. Yeah. So it's September 2023. All right, and to wrap up, I wanted to show you the interesting conclusion we draw with this Nestorska group that I was part of. We were trying to develop the understanding of why Ukraine struggles to transform to democracy. We kind of sketched the survival mode values and self-expression mode values, and try to understand that we will not move towards them in one step. It's like a very different ideas of the society. For one, you need to trust to survive and move faster, and in the other, you have to mistrust to survive. So it's kind of, you need like a little stepping stone in between to get across. And we tried to develop this transition mode And I would like to challenge you a little bit. Maybe you will have an idea. How can we move from the idea of dividing people into friends or foes, and on the other side, we have like all people are potential partners. We don't have to divide. So what would be in the middle? Or for example, the other is a threat, while in the developed world, in a democracy world, the other is interesting, is a something that you need to be curious about. Or revenge against the rule of law, or survival against quality of life. Government is power, then government is service. Quick intuitive decisions or slow strategic thinking. Attention to threats or attention to reasons and success stories. Who is to blame or what I can do? And family versus the social state. So these are basically those where the aspect we wanted to address with the civil society and with the education. And I will leave that open so far because we're running out of time. I'll skip that. There were a couple of ideas I can discuss with you later. But what I wanted to finish up with is the idea of Hannah Arendt, that the aim of totalitarian education has never been to instill convictions, but to destroy the ability to form them. And that is one of the reasons why I wanted to continue with education as for what I would like to do. And how can education help? So what I'm focusing on teaching my students, which is very tricky to teach critical thinking in the time of war, because critical thinking is to go through a piece of an opinion. And if you agree with that emotionally, you still have to scrutinize and say, no, there's not enough evidence and not enough reasoning, and that feels so wrong in the time of war. But still, we are trying, and I try hard to separate arguing with ideas, not with people, and also understanding the context, understanding why it is hard for us to think critically at this point, providing a safe space to express an opinion and to ask tricky questions. So students are very unsure at first that they can say anything, and I will not punish them. And also understanding reasoning and evidence, understanding biases and asking questions and being willing to understand, and emancipation as well, because once you become more independent financially and once you invest in your skills, you're not so reliant on the state, on the circumstances you were born into, and so on. So I also connect our democratization effort with developing of IT industry that helps people earn money with their brains, right? And still live in Ukraine and buy a car just by earning money with their brains. That is very, very unusual. Yes, because you either have to be, at the power or a politician or, a criminal or someone, or just find a way to trick the government or others. But it's an interesting development that help people to free the space for development and development thinking. Okay, thank you so much. I'm done. And yeah.
Thank you, Viktoriya. It was really, very, very detailed, somewhat sombering, but thank you for sharing such a personal journey. It was really fascinating. So we'll come to questions. If anyone's got a question, please stick their hand up. Then please state your name and cue the brief question. I'd just like to jump in there first in the front. I don't know if it can be calculated the size of the diaspora overseas, but I know it's said a lot of people have left. Do they still have the vote? Can they still play a part in the democratic process overseas?
There was also a survey about the people willing to vote and understanding should the election be held in spring, like it's spring in Ukraine coming so soon, and there is still no answer to that. So there are concerns that the election will not be held properly. So I think, I don't have the data at the moment, but I think the idea was that Ukrainians were still supporting the elections, and willing them to be democratic, because we went through falsification of elections and we with Yanukovych, and that's still very fresh in the memory. So elections are precious, although, you know, sometimes you don't have much influence during an election if you didn't do the work before, right? So yeah, but the tool is important, and I'm not sure how it will be organized. Can't really tell, but I think that the idea to participate in the election is quite strong. I remember during the Orange Revolution, I was in Germany, and I went to the embassy and waited 2 hours in line to vote. Yeah.
Michael. We'll just grab the microphone.
Michael Hellman, sorry, member. There's very little written about what Ukrainian people think of your president, Zelensky. Are there polls on that, or what's your assessment as to the opinion of most Ukrainians about the president?
Yeah, they still support Zelensky, and it's a phenomenon. Zelensky is really a phenomenon because it was, like with many things in Ukraine, it was not predicted to happen so. But he gained a lot of support, and I think he managed to find a way to gather those who undecided on what they want to see as a president, and kind of combine that in a promise. But still, he's an actor, and he played a tremendous communication role during the start of war. It was excellent, and I don't think Poroshenko would be able to do that. He has other skills which are also great, but not at that point. So I think the role Zelensky played at the beginning of the war was essential. Now the support is dropping a little bit, but yeah, the moral of the people is still, it's hard to really separate that from what is happening during the war. You know, if we have, for example, Zelensky against Putin, of course, Zelensky will have the priority. If you have Zelensky against Zaluzhny, not really. Zaluzhny is the head of army, so not really quite that sure. So there is still a lot that it's unclear, and still a lot of administrative resource that is still very untransparent. And to be honest, I don't know what's going to happen when the war ends, because also there are a lot of risks with the weapons, with the people coming back from war, with the integrating the society in the new reality. You know, it's all very unsure. I think like we need to again sit and think and recreate like Ukraine of the future we want again. But the capacity to do that, it's very limited, because people are very exhausted. And like, you know, imagine having a flood, you know, or fires, bushfires, and then it lasts for 2 years. And every day it started new. So it's a lot of deaths, a lot of destruction. And every day, we don't have it in the media, but it's still very acute.
We'll bring a microphone over just so, but I'll jump in with another one just right now. President Zelensky has been seen as a master communicator, and anywhere he goes, he tailors his message to the audience. But within Ukraine itself, I'm thinking, if an election's coming, how important is the role of social media, and how much is that then open to misinformation coming from Russia?
Our civil society is quite strong in fighting against misinformation. It's one of the efforts you don't usually see, but because they are like stopping the attacks every day, and you just don't see it because they're not coming through, right? But it keeps civil society very active just to prevent the authoritarianism to happen, but it prevents us from moving forward. So I assume that people will still vote for Zelensky still, and it's also the matter of having another candidate that is attractive enough. Again, so it has to be either Zaluzhny, which is very popular as well, and now we have a little bit of fears about what's gonna happen to him if he's such an attractive candidate. So it's still tricky. It's still not quite democratic in the understanding of what elections really are. So it's still a little bit of this tool of power, right? So we have this tool to decide at this particular moment. So we need to use it. Otherwise, someone else will. Sorry.
David Lamb, Institute member. The Americans were great supporters and very quickly, and the Ukrainian people must have been delighted with the support that was coming internationally. But now, with the holdup in Congress of American funding, surely resentment against American. How much do you know about that? And secondly, Zelensky has to fight two wars. One is his control of the environment, the war environment in Ukraine, but the other one is the international relationships. Could you comment about that, please?
Yes, I'll try. Again, don't understand much in the international relations. I'm sorry. Although I'm very grateful for AII to invite me and organize the presentation. But what I understand is Ukrainian people feel resentful not only towards Americans, but also other nations that still consider a compromise as a way to finish that war, and still consider Russia as a player that can we negotiate with. So we consider it that there has been a lot of crimes, and we gather a lot of evidence to prove that there were crimes. And we understand that it needs to be acknowledged, and people needs to be responsible for that before we even can talk about it. But still, I think because there are other events, right, which it's not a very good competition, of course, but there are other events in the world that attract attention. So kind of the world forgets a little bit about Ukraine. And I understand we need to do our homework, right? We need to do what we need to do to be a more powerful and more capable nation. But some of the things we're just small, And yeah, so about the international relations and Zelensky, I think he's also exhausted. That's what I understand, from a lot of pressure and a lot of pressure inside and outside. And I just really hope he can hold on and just to keep Ukraine whole, keep the idea of keeping the territories, not just because of the territories itself. So it's not about property. It's about the idea that the international law cannot be so easily, forgotten. So it's important principle. And I think Ukraine is such an important case because it's not only about fighting for democracy, it's also trying to fight for democracy and live through this democracy and keeping each other, supporting each other and reminding each other, no, we don't have to hate Russians just because they're Russians. We need to hate what they did. All the things we need to remind ourselves all the time, but also there is so much pain and so much destruction caused by our neighbor that it's hard to separate those things and keep yourself able to think critically, to be tolerant, to act within the framework of the law, while your country is being destroyed. And it's just sometimes it's very hard.